Welcome to another speaker series event brought to you by the Cultural Knowledge Consortium. The CKC is a joint interagency effort of the U.S. government to support the development of sociocultural knowledge and facilitate knowledge exchange across a range of sociocultural communities of interest. Contact information, the CKC blog, discussion forums, and other resources are available on the CKC web portal at ckc.army.mil. You will also find a link to recordings of all speaker series presentations on the CKC YouTube channel. You may submit questions using the chat question and answer pod in the lower portion of your screen at any time. We'll respond to as many as time allows. Content of this presentation should not be construed as advocacy, nor representing the views of the CKC or the U.S. government. This presentation is unclassified and intended for public release. Enjoy this presentation.
And good afternoon, folks. I'm Jay Hunt, CKC Operations. I'd like to welcome you to another speaker series event brought to you by the Cultural Knowledge Consortium. Today, our guest is Dr. Lauren Johnson. Dr. Lauren Johnson comes to us from the Department of Anthropology at the South Florida University, where she has taught both anthropology and English for academic purposes, as well as at Ashford University and the Hillsborough Community College. Her doctoral dissertation is in ethnography that explores the issues of sex work, tourism, and gender roles in Jamaica. Her research interests include social constructions of race, gender, and class, sex work and tourism, and crime and insecurity in the African Diaspora, particularly in the Caribbean and Latin America. Again, you may enter your questions at any time in the chat box, the lower portion of your screen. So, at this time, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Dr. Lauren Johnson. Ma'am, floor is yours.
Great, thanks so much. Today I'll be talking about the sex trade and sex work in the Caribbean. And first, to give you an outline, I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of sexing the Caribbean, or sort of the exotification of men and women in the Caribbean region. I will also talk about sex and tourism, the sex tourism industry, which is closely linked to human trafficking in the region, HIV/AIDS, which is an extreme concern for the region, being the after sub-Saharan Africa, the region in the world with the highest HIV prevalence to date, as well as specific country cases where I'll talk more specifically about the situation of sex work and trafficking in these particular places. To give a bit of background, I became interested actually in the study of sex work while I was studying abroad in the Caribbean in two different countries, Cuba and the Dominican Republic. In these places, there are a great deal of sex tourism takes place in both countries, and this is compounded with the issues of migration and with trafficking of both adults and of youth. My particular dissertation research focused on sex tourism in Negril, Jamaica, and this was a study conducted in 2010 through 2011, where I looked at the sociocultural, the economic, and the health impact of sex tourism in Negril. And this was particularly focused on male sex workers who are involved in relationships with female foreign women. In terms of the Caribbean region, a lot of the images that we receive about the place, in addition to showing natural environments and paradise, there are also ones that sort of sexualize Caribbean populations. The images on this particular slide, several of them come from documentaries regarding sex tourism. In the top right and the middle, we have documentaries that show depictions of men who sell sex to women in Barbados and Jamaica. On the lower left, this image comes from a film from the 1970s in Jamaica called Smile Orange, in which a man works in a hotel, and on the side he has relationships with foreign women tourists in order to supplement his income. He also teaches a younger person in the hotel, a younger man, how to do the same thing. The other two images are more popular films that have demonstrated sex tourism specifically between American and Canadian women and black males in the Caribbean. What's happened historically in the region is that people have been deemed, have been sexualized. This means that they've been perceived as overly sexual, both men and women. For women, this is often shown in the stereotypical images of the mulata, or the brown woman who is sexually available, who is also who can charge money for sex, but who's someone who's sort of a temptress. For men in the Caribbean, this is somewhat more recent of a phenomenon where men are sexualized in such a way as that women go there. In Jamaica, they call it seeking the big bamboo, in terms of men actually being used for their physical prowess. Often we've seen this in the phenomenon of rent-a-rasta or rent-a-dreads, which is when women go to the island seeking men who are either participants or who claim to be Rastafari. This comes along with dreadlocks and this image of being natural people who are also sexualized in some ways. Sex and tourism, specifically for the region, relate to the issues of mobility and migration. For many islands, you have people who go back and forth to the island, either people living abroad from there, you have tourists traveling, you have foreign-born residents moving to these islands, and you also have either urban migration or migration to tourism centers. And particularly for places that have become dependent on the tourism industry, such as Jamaica, Dominican Republic, Cuba, and many other islands, many people, in order to find job opportunities, travel to tourism centers. People can find work either in hotels and transportation or in the informal economy as vendors and such. Another issue with that comes into play with sex and tourism is that of liminality. Research on sex and tourism indicate that men and women who travel abroad are sort of in these liminal spaces. People go to different destinations as tourists and try to experience the place to an extent. But there's only so much that you can actually become involved in the local scenery and the local culture. And tourists are sort of seen as liminal people. They're in a sort of marginal space where they can participate somewhat in the local culture and meet people, but at the same time they're always seen as outsiders, as foreigners. Time compression comes into play as well, and this is the idea that while on vacation, something that probably many of us have experienced, time seems to move faster. A 2-week vacation can feel like a month or 2 months have passed. And this is because we try to fit in a lot of activities. We try to experience as much as we can, sightsee. And this can also link to relationships between foreign tourists and local people in these places. These factors can play a part to the extent that relationships that develop between tourists and local people can move very quickly. People can engage in sexual activities more quickly than they would at home, and at the same time get involved with people that maybe they wouldn't in their home environment. Studies of sex and tourism have also shown that local populations perceive a link between tourism and criminality. People living in tourism destinations who are not involved in the tourism industry necessarily believe that tourism in those places leads to more drug use, more immoral behavior, and to a lack of maybe values or that they see as traditional values or even religious ones. According to Julia O'Connell Davidson, The term sex tourism can be used as a broad term to describe the activities of individuals who, whether or not they set out with this intention, use their economic power to attain powers of sexual command over local women, men, and or children while traveling for leisure purposes. This is a particularly interesting topic to study in the Caribbean because of the fact that it's attracted sex tourists and other migrant populations over a long period of time. And it's important here to consider the power dynamics that are involved in relationships between local people and foreigners. The foreign tourists who come into these places generally have more money or higher social standing, higher socioeconomic power than the local people. They're able to travel and visit these places and participate in sort of decadent vacations that many local people couldn't afford. Also, we have the issue of emigration and the fact that many people who engage in sex tourism in terms of the local population are seeking ways to leave their countries. And the fact that they can link up with foreigners who have the ability to get them visas or whom they can marry in order to get citizenship abroad plays a definite part. In terms of human trafficking, the Caribbean region is also a hot zone in terms of the trafficking of men, women, and children. For the most part, this is something that affects local women and children as well. Individual factors that have to do with human trafficking are poverty, unemployment, lack of formal education, history of physical or sexual abuse, homelessness, drug abuse, and gang membership. In addition to that, there are outside factors involving the high global demand for laborers. People are willing to take jobs abroad, which can possibly lead to situations where they're vulnerable for trafficking. There are political, social, and economic crises that occur that make human trafficking more viable options in certain places. Also, the issue of male dominance, the fact that there are women who are sort of powerless in terms of how they're treated, how they are perceived in their social circumstances, and that they can find a way out in dealing with men who are involved in the trafficking industry. Additionally, there are networks between Latin American, Caribbean countries as well as Europe that have recruitment methods that are pretty sophisticated. And this can lead to trafficking within countries and between them, between regions even. Local corruption in particular countries not only opens a way for trafficking to occur, but you also find that there are local officials in some countries who are actually involved in the sex trade and trafficking. Other issues include restrictive immigration policies, government disinterest in the issue of trafficking, and limited economic opportunities for women in both Latin America and the Caribbean. HIV/AIDS in the Caribbean is again an important issue to consider in terms of the sex trade in the region because of the high prevalence, which is estimated to be around 1% across the board in the region. It's the highest in the Bahamas and the lowest in Cuba, which is only between 0.1 and 0.2% of the adult population, which I'll get back to in a minute. AIDS is a leading cause of death for the 25 to 44 age group throughout the Caribbean region, and 3/4 of the people living with HIV are in Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Sorry about that. The Dominican Republic is an interesting case in terms of looking at issues of sex work, sex tourism, and trafficking. Migration is an issue in the Dominican Republic and Haiti, and you find that there are certain populations of particularly low socioeconomic status between the two countries that travel back and forth, and you'll find that there are people, particularly before and even since it's probably increased from Haiti to the Dominican Republic, people looking for economic opportunities and for jobs. Women from Haiti participate in the sex trade in the Dominican Republic, as well as Dominican women. While you have urban migration in these places, you also have people migrating to tourism centers, particularly on the north coast of the Dominican Republic and outside of the capital in a town called Boca Chica. In these places, sex tourism is particularly prevalent. You find male and female sex workers conducting heterosexual sex work and men who have sex with men who are participating here in sex work with tourists. The Dominican Republic also is an interesting case because of the fact that it has a strong sex worker organization. And this is something that has helped in the situation of this country in terms of organizing sex workers, educating people about opportunities outside of sex work, as well as opportunities for making sure that people learn about safer sex practices, the use of contraceptives and things like this. This has also helped to decrease the HIV/AIDS rate in the Dominican Republic in recent times. The same has not occurred for Haiti. Cuba is another country in which sex tourism has had a particularly significant impact. There are places in the tourism destinations of Cuba that experience high prevalence of sex workers and people participating in sex tourism. Again, this happens with male sex workers, female sex workers, as well as youth. Sex tourism industry, particularly in La Habana, the capital, is one that is visible all over the city for the most part, particularly in places that tourists frequent, such as hotels, clubs, and bars where foreigners are welcome. This is something that is somewhat overlooked in the case of Cuba in terms of how government and police officials deal with the problem. There are places in which you can see sex workers called jineteras or jineteros on corners directly across from police officers in the city. This is something that people have adjusted to. At the same time, because of the restriction on immigration from Cuba, to and from Cuba, the situation there is one where many people see sex work as an opportunity to leave the country. And for some, it seems as though it's the only opportunity once they can find someone to help them get visa or to get married, to leave the country legally. This is sort of seen as a way out. And you have people of different levels of education and backgrounds who are participating in sex tourism in order to leave the country. HIV treatment is a unique situation in Cuba because of the fact that the country has quarantined HIV, people living with HIV for a great deal of time, and this has kept the prevalence of HIV at a very low rate, the lowest in the Caribbean, in fact. This is crucial for a country like this where so many people are participating in the sex industry. It's absolutely necessary that precautions are taken. It also is helpful that contraceptives are cheap and easily available around the country. In the case of Curacao, this is one example from the Dutch Antilles, which are unique in the Caribbean in terms of having legalized sex work. And in Curacao, for example, there is a large popular brothel that is frequented by local people and foreigners alike. called Campo Alegre, sort of translated to be like the happy ranch. And this is a place where foreign female sex workers are brought in to work in the sex industry and who are supposed to be regulated in terms of their STI and HIV status on a regular basis. The fact that these are foreign workers is an indication that despite the legalized sex work in the country, it isn't acceptable necessarily to have local women working in sex work. Most of the women who work in the sex industry in Curacao and other islands of the Dutch Antilles are from the Dominican Republic and Colombia, with some other people mixed in from Venezuela, Jamaica, and other islands. One particularly interesting fact about these women who are brought in to work in the country is that they're actually chosen often to be lighter-skinned or white women, which is in contrast to the mainly black population. And this is another way in which people are sort of sexualized, and in this case, lighter-skinned women are seen as more desirable than their darker-skinned counterparts. Campo Alegre is seen as an attraction for the island, which doesn't have a particularly strong tourism industry. What's also happening in Curacao and other islands of the Dutch Antilles is that human trafficking is occurring in such that women are given 3-month sex work visas to come to these places. At times, women are hired to be waitresses or bartenders or work in other services in places like this, like the Campo Alegre. Once they get there, they find out that they're expected to sell sex. And this is sort of women being tricked into the sex industry from other countries, particularly in Latin America, unknowingly. Barbados is another case of sex tourism in the sex industry having a big impact. This is an island where the sex tourism industry is more specifically focused on men who sell sex to foreign tourist women. On this island, they're termed beach boys, and they're generally people who work in the tourism industry formally or in the informal tourism industry, maybe jet ski or water sports operators and things like this. What's happening in Barbados now is that researchers are focusing on this population as potentially more at risk for STIs and HIV. And this population is being targeted with peer outreach, sex education, and knowledge about contraception and safer sex practices in general. The picture that you see here is actually from a major event during their carnival, which is called Crop Over. And this is an event with thousands of people where Durex has outreach workers handing out condoms for free. And this particular person has a shirt on that says Durex because you don't know where she's been. And this is a particular facet of the outreach for public health in terms of targeting men for contraceptive use as opposed to women. In Barbados, Phillips has done a great deal of research on sex tourism on the island. One quote is, "The white female assumes a hegemonic power in Barbadian society, denied to the local Barbadian woman. Her encounters with the beach hustlers represent an opportunity to test out this hegemonic dominance under the balmy skies in the center of the other, with the other who, she maintains, is so different from the men at home, so aggressive. She adopts the role of economic provider within his cultural context." This is something particular to instances in which local men have relationships with foreign tourist women for money, in which men are actually seen as vulnerable here, who are relying on a woman for economic assistance or to rise in economic status. And in these cases, there are women who are drawn to men who they see as exotic, people they want to take care of, and who are identified as being the other. Now I'll focus more on Jamaica and the research that I participated in, ethnographic research, which focuses on qualitative methods and using interviews and observations. A quote that I have here is from Beverly Mullings, who has done research on sex tourism in Jamaica specifically. Few representatives of the Jamaican tourism industry have been willing to acknowledge that a sex tourism industry exists on the island, and even fewer have sought to analyze the structural forces that shape the conditions under which workers trade their services. The issue of sex tourism is one that's difficult to contend with on a national level because of the fact that so many of these Caribbean islands are reliant on the tourism industry. It's then difficult to sort of control the occurrence of sex tourism, as well as to teach people about contraceptive use and HIV testing, because of the fact that tourism ministries are afraid of scaring away tourists, and they're afraid to dwell too much on the idea that there is a risk of STIs and HIV on these islands. They'd rather that tourists focus on visiting paradise and enjoying their time sightseeing, traveling, and things like this. This is particularly the case in islands that are visited a great deal during spring break. These are seen as locations where young people can go to have fun, and governments don't want to point out the fact that sex tourism is an issue in these particular places. Negril, Jamaica, on the northwest coast of the island, is where I focused my research, particularly because of the images of Negril that are portrayed in the media and in tourism promotion on the island. These pictures from websites on Negril show different images of people as being part of the place. And in some of these images, it's clear that people are being sexualized as part of what it is to go to Negril. Hedonism, for example, is a famous institution both in Montego Bay and Negril, where people can enjoy a nudist resort. And this is something where sex is sort of being sold as part of the tourism product. Negril is a great site to consider tourism and the impact of sex tourism because it's a very navigable place. There's 7 Mile Beach in Negril, and that leads into Negril Cliffs. But along the beach, there are establishments the whole way, including hotels, restaurants, bars, and clubs. And these continue into the cliffs of Negril. It's basically a straight shot from the beach into the cliffs of the town. Sex tourism is visible throughout the town. Most of the establishments there are designed particularly for tourism and tourists. And the local population, which is around 3,000, is always outnumbered at any given time by the tourists who are there, particularly in these small establishments, these small locally owned establishments, as well as large all-inclusive resorts that dot the coast of Jamaica. This place has a unique tourism product. Negril has a slogan that says, "No shirt, no shoes, no problem." It's sort of the capital of casual in terms of Jamaica's tourism industry. The sort of place where you can walk around barefoot, you don't have to dress up to go anywhere. Also a place that is known for the open consumption of marijuana and mushrooms, despite the fact that both are illegal on the island. Negril, in addition to other places, tourist destinations in Jamaica, is a place where people can come to hustle a living. This means working in the informal economy. You have men and women who work as vendors, who sell drugs like marijuana, cocaine, and mushrooms. And you also have people who work indirectly in the tourism industry through transportation services, tour guide, informal tour guides, and things like this. What's interesting specifically about Negril is that there is a significant population of men who are involved in hustling a living. They self-identify as hustlers. These people often have multiple jobs, maybe using their cars as informal taxis, providing tour services, renting motorcycles or bikes for tourists, all sorts of services directed towards tourism, particularly to earn a living and to earn more money than one might be able to outside of the tourism industry. These men tend to also be seen as cultural brokers. These are men who are popular, who know the place, who know people locally, and who can provide tourists with a sort of quote-unquote authentic experience while they're traveling. People who can take you to restaurants or bars outside of the beaten path, and to explain local slang, local sayings, and customs and things like that. There are a number of these men who are involved in the drug trade, and this is part of the attraction of a place like Negril, but it's also something that can cause problems in terms of violence and in terms of local crime. Men who are sex workers are also sort of part of this group of hustlers in the place. They basically advertise themselves in such a way that they can provide a tourist with whatever he or she wants. Some of these are able to arrange liaisons between visiting men and local women in terms of sex work, and others who will offer sex themselves normally to women tourists, although at times there are men who will sell sex to other foreign men. HIV in Jamaica is of particular concern. This is one of the islands that has a higher prevalence rate than some others. The risk factors involved are multiple sex partners. 76% of Jamaican males between the ages of 15 and 24 and have been surveyed say that they have more than one sexual partner at a time. And casual sex is particularly prevalent among this population of the same age as well. There are a number of people on the island who participate in transactional sex. 37% of the sexually active population claims to have been involved in transactional sex at one point, and this means that they've had sex for some sort of material exchange, either for money or some other material gain in their lives. This is connected to the history of STI infection. People who have had STIs in the past tend to be more at risk for HIV. Another factor is that of poor health-seeking behaviors among men in Jamaica. This is indicative of the fact that there are men who won't seek doctor's care, won't seek treatment when they're sick. The same occurs when they have a sexually transmitted infection or they have symptoms. They won't necessarily seek a doctor's care. Drug use is another factor, as well as early onset of sexual activity. Jamaica has one of the earliest onsets of sexual activity. I believe it's currently the average age for first sex is 11 for boys and 12 or 13 for girls. This is in connection with inconsistent condom use, particularly among younger populations where they don't necessarily use condoms every time they have sex. And when you have such high rates of casual sex encounters and transactional sex, this can leave people particularly vulnerable for HIV infection. The estimated prevalence for Jamaica right now is 1.6%. with 32,000 people living with HIV on the island, which is the highest number in the English-speaking Caribbean. As many as 50% of the people living with HIV are unaware of their status. The picture that you see here is a public health campaign from the Ministry of Health in terms of teaching people to use condoms through this pinch, leave an inch, and roll concept. Vulnerable populations, as in other Caribbean islands and other places, are commercial sex workers are a particularly vulnerable population. The rate of HIV prevalence among this population in Jamaica is around 9%, and it's much higher for men who have sex with men at between 32 and 33%. Other vulnerable populations include prison inmates and the youth. Again, because of this early onset of sexual activity, inconsistent condom use, as well as unintended pregnancy. In my interviews with men and women in the local population in Negril, I asked questions about people's perceptions of risk and sex, particularly sex tourism in Jamaica and in Negril more specifically. One of my informants, a 28-year-old bartender, says anywhere in the country where you have tourism, where the tourism spots, it's more likely to be higher. Here he's referring to the HIV rate. Because you have the large influx of tourists coming in and out from all different places. This is someone who's worked in the tourism industry for a number of years, and which is a common view there, they see the tourism industry as having an impact on health in terms of increasing the rate of STIs and HIV infection. Another informant, a 24-year-old CD vendor, in this quote, basically he's saying that the health system is bad because of the fact that so many people are having casual sex and they're getting what he refers to as gonorrhea, which people in Jamaica tend to refer to any sexually transmitted infection as gonorrhea. He also says that young men will tell each other that when they get an infection that they've been shot. He says that the girl shot me last night with that Uzi or with the M16. That's slang that young men will use for getting an STI from a woman. Healthcare professionals in Negril during interviews expressed surprise over the incidence of syphilis among young men in Negril. And one doctor spoke to me about a herpes corridor. He's worked all over Jamaica and sees more cases of herpes along the northern coast where all of the main tourism destinations are on the island. Doctors also expressed a possible link between sex work with tourists and HIV infection, although there are no government studies to show that there's an actual correlation between sex tourism and HIV infection. Additionally, several doctors mentioned poor health-seeking behaviors among men as another important factor in terms of risk and sex work. Part of the results of my study were determining whether or not male sex workers are a particularly vulnerable population, which I determined that they are. This population of men who have sex with foreign women tourists for money they engage in transactional sex with these people. They also tend to have multiple sex partners. Some of the men there in Jamaica, they're referred to as gigolos, have multiple women who they have relationships with who live abroad. And these are people they'll call and request money from. They will also entertain these women when they come to visit the island. There are people who tell stories about men who will leave one girlfriend at the airport in Montego Bay and wait for the next plane to arrive from abroad with the next woman they're involved with. Inconsistent condom use also occurs with this population, as well as a fear of HIV/AIDS testing, which is prevalent across Jamaica, but particularly among Jamaican men and young Jamaican men who claim that they don't want to know their status, or they're afraid of getting tested, also because of the stigma that people who actually do have HIV are homosexual. You have the issue of poor health-seeking behaviors among men in general that affects this population, as well as the issue of mobility, that these are men who often travel across the island, or they come to tourist centers from other parts of the island. Then there's the social vulnerability of men being involved in sex work. The idea that men can actually sell sex to women, which challenges most people's concepts of what a sex worker is. They don't necessarily self-identify as sex workers, certainly not as prostitutes, because that's seen as something that only women do. At the same time, these men can be marginalized, not just because of their work in the sex industry, but because they tend to be of low socioeconomic status, without formal educations, and maybe often unskilled laborers. A theme that was recurring in my research was that of men who have sex with both men and women. These are not men who necessarily identify as bisexual, particularly in the case of Jamaica, where there's rampant homophobia throughout the country. But there are men who will reach out to foreign male tourists to engage in sex tourism, who also have local women and foreign women that they engage in sex work with. There's also the issue of men who want to cover they don't want to be identified as men who have sex with men. So in order to not be identified as homosexual, they have sex with foreign women tourists. And they might actually have sex with local men at the same time. Some of the challenges in dealing with sex work in general, but particularly with male sex work populations, is the lack of quantitative and qualitative data. There's no research at the national level of how many male sex workers there are in Jamaica. And this is something that happens throughout the Caribbean. And you'll find that because men aren't identified as sex workers per se, because of their gender, they aren't necessarily counted or taken into account in terms of public health outreach. Also, it's difficult to target a population that doesn't identify as a sex work population. And it's also difficult to address men who have sex with men and women who engage in sex tourism, because these people won't, for the most part, self-identify as such. The cooperation of the tourism sector is also a difficult challenge to overcome, because of the fact that the tourism sector wants to promote tourism in these islands, make sure that people see these as viable options, places to visit and to engage in touristic activities. They don't necessarily want to point out the risk that's involved in terms of sexual relationships. And this is also an issue that's become a wider issue of increasing crime in the Caribbean and the promotion of tourism, despite the fact that there are so many, there's a lot of violent crime increasing throughout the islands. So I'll stop there and take questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Lauren Johnson. And while our audience is entering their questions into the chat box at the bottom of the screen, I have a couple that I'd like to throw out. This whole thing seems like a fairly alien concept to many folks. What are the motivations of both male and female sex workers? I mean, what do they hope to achieve through this? Is this a full-time gig? Is this something to pay the bills? Or is it more of a forced thing? And what are the motivations?
Great. Well, I think this is something that ranges between countries. For example, as I mentioned, in Cuba, the issue of immigration is such a significant one that I think most of the people who engage in sex work and sex tourism specifically are trying to find ways to emigrate from the island. In places like Jamaica, for example, you'll find that generally people are trying to earn a living or to supplement their incomes. There are people who are trying to leave Jamaica to go abroad to the US or to Europe, using sex tourism as a channel to do so. But you'll also find that there are people who intend to stay on the island. It's just for them a way of making kind of easy money. If that makes any sense. There are people who have jobs in the tourism industry. They can work in hotels as bartenders, maids, things like this. But they can supplement their incomes by engaging in sex work with tourists at the same time.
Okay, well, during your research, how did you go about talking to the, well, I guess the tourist boards of their perspectives of the sex trades in their countries? It's got to be a little bit dodgy, given that it's still illegal in many of the countries.
Right. Interestingly, I had an important interview at the tourism board in Jamaica, and I tried to approach the questions of sex tourism as politically correctly as possible. But it was sort of an open topic. This is something, at least in Jamaica, that seems to have been, it seems to be discussed fairly openly, because everyone realizes that it happens on the island. It's just the extent to which people are concerned about it or think that it's a concern in terms of health is more difficult to gauge. Part of the issue with dealing with the tourist board in Jamaica is that there are people who have cross interests. What I mean by that is some of the people who work for the tourism board are actually involved with some of the larger hotel industries on the island. One of the people I interviewed, for example, at the tourism board in Jamaica, later left to become part of the board of an all-inclusive resort hotel. So I think for some, it's a challenge to get through to the tourism board about problems with the sex trade, because it's recognized across the board that it occurs. Even in Cuba, everyone knows that there's a huge sex tourism industry, but you don't want to deter tourists from visiting your island, particularly when that's your main source of income.
So this then becomes just another concierge service. You can go down to the front desk and get whatever it is you like, whether it's you know, something in the sex trade or the drugs, as you say, regardless of their illegality.
It depends on the place, and it depends on what type of establishment. For example, there are some, particularly the all-inclusive hotels, that are more strict about their rules in terms of relationships between staff and tourists. They want to keep people separate, for example. They want to keep, for the most part, drugs off the property, with the possible allowance of marijuana in the case of Jamaica. But yes, there are definitely smaller hotels, particularly locally owned ones, where there's sort of a package. In addition to that, some islands, particularly Cuba, the Dominican Republic, they have sex tourism packages. These are packages that tourists can buy, generally men, where your hotel stay, your transportation, and sex with local women is included in the package.
Okay, and a question from our guest said that most of it seems like you concentrated your research on the male sex work. On the female side, is it that says some social scientists have just suggested that Jamaican women, being ostensibly more assertive than the Spanish-speaking Caribbean women, don't usually have pimps or work for an organization. Is that what you found as well?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure necessarily if this is an issue of submissiveness per se. It might be a question more of male dominance in terms of the sex trade, but there are definitely pimps who are at work in Jamaica. In my particular research location, there were men who self-identified as such. And some of them were involved in the sex trade themselves. They would sell sex themselves to women, and they would also organize women to have sex with foreign men for money. I'm not sure if this is an issue of being submissive. I think it's more an issue of the organization and male.
Okay, well, as long as we're talking about the organization aspect of this, it kind of gets back to the topic of how sex tourism is policed in these countries. You talked about the organization aspect, particularly in the Dominican Republic. This implies some sort of maybe an institutionalization. How is sex tourism policed? Do they just look the other way? Is it a matter of corruption? Or do they gain a bit of legitimacy by this sort of quasi-institutionalization?
Right, yeah, I definitely think there's an issue of legitimacy. There are people throughout the Caribbean, particularly on larger islands with more developed sex tourism industries, that have been advocating for the legalization of sex work. And generally, this doesn't fly very well on the national level, particularly among conservative populations like that of Jamaica, where you have people in religiously conservative islands, maybe in a different sense, who overall populations do not want legalized sex work at all. But sex worker organizations, which, as far as I know, only occur in the Caribbean among women sex workers and some who have maybe cross-gender sex workers from men to women. These are organizations that want to make sure that the rights of female sex workers are not abused. And this is in terms of human rights and not necessarily the local law. So even though sex work can be illegal in a particular place, these are organizations that are fighting for the rights, for example, of women not to be arrested and searched unduly, for people not to be abused. There are cases, for example, in the Dominican Republic of sex workers who are harassed, raped by local law enforcement, right? So these are organizations that can work towards, on the sex worker side, they can work towards making sure that these women protect themselves in terms of sex, in terms of not putting themselves in dangerous or risky environments, but also in terms of how they're treated in society to make sure that they're not abused or that they're not, they don't get involved in illegal trafficking.
Okay, and our guest actually is the CKC director, Carl Prinzo. He has a question here. He says that Negril sounds like a place where the government acknowledges, not condones, or even supports this sex tourist trade because of the money involved. Did you examine the dichotomy of this government support for what's otherwise illegal activity? And it may even include the drug activity as well.
Right. The issue of government in Negril is a questionable one. There is practically no local government. What I mean by that is some of these small towns, aside from the police force, they don't necessarily have a governing body. Negril, for example, has it's part of, well, it has a board, a local tourism board, and it also represents the commercial interests of people in the town. So its members are maybe hotel owners, bar owners, things like this. Outside of this and the police department, there's also the local branch of the tourism police. And these are there basically to protect tourists and have only in the last few years been granted the capability of arresting people. Until then, they were just sort of there to make sure that tourists were sort of protected without much power. The government interests don't really come through so much, except from the tourism side, the tourism board that promotes tourism in the place, which again has strong ties with larger all-inclusive properties and large hotels, chain hotels that you can find throughout the Caribbean. And then there's some representation from the Ministry of Health in terms of the parish health department and the local health clinic. What happens overall, and this came out in my interviews, sort of larger NGOs and the government on a more general level, is that the health department and the tourism board are sort of at odds to an extent. And this is more a perception on the part of people from the Ministry of Health who find that they're challenged by the tourism board when they attempt to do certain things to promote public health, to promote safer sex practices in the town. And from the tourism side, everything is hunky-dory, and we're just trying to get our numbers up, keep up the numbers of tourists. So it's hard to see necessarily challenges outside of that, but it presents a huge issue in terms of how to deal with vulnerability and risk in terms of sex work and trafficking when the government doesn't necessarily work towards protecting these interests.
Well, and as a matter of the government policies with diseases so rampant, what policies for either the STIs or the HIV prevention have been most effective? Is it the government-based policies, or is it more of a do the resorts police the workers up themselves as almost as a selling point? We have the cleanest people. What policies do you see?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Actually, there's some work being done in Jamaica and Barbados and a few other islands that's trying to create HIV workplace policies. And this entails education on STIs and HIV for tourism workers and testing without stigma. A lot of the problem here in these islands is that hotels want to test their workers to make sure that they are clean, as you might say. But they don't. But there's also the issue of violating people's rights, violating their workers' rights, and the fear of people that, well, if it's found out that I have an STI or HIV, I'll be fired. And their government policies are working towards fixing this on the side of the Ministry of Health. And some of these are being supported by the local hotel industry.
Okay, and just one last question before I ask you for your thoughts. Carl Prinsloo asks, what is the attraction of a Rastafarian? That seems to be a selling point.
Yeah, it's definitely been a selling point. Some of the English-speaking Caribbean islands, including Jamaica and Barbados, as well as some of the smaller islands that are sort of developing these sex tourism industries. Part of it is, I think, the exotification of Rastafari. This can be seen in the music of Bob Marley, the allure of marijuana for some people, and men who present themselves as Rastas in order to participate in sex tourism present this image of being very natural, and this is something that also relates to sex work, in that many of these men refuse to wear condoms because it's as though they want to appear to be natural, and that they don't use any harmful substances or artificial things, and that they don't believe in having sex with condoms as a part of that. Some of this can be attractive to women who appreciate this particular subculture, which is heavily promoted in the islands. It's part of the promotion of tourism for many islands in terms of T-shirts and pictures and images of Bob Marley and other Rastas. Sort of a selling point, culturally speaking.
Sure. Okay, I think that's all the question we have. Do you have a closing thought for us?
Well, I just want to thank you and just emphasize the importance of using qualitative research for understanding cultures and the issues that we face in the Caribbean. This is my passion, but there are a lot of other ways in which qualitative research can have an impact in the study of human beings and the issues that we face in general.
Wonderful, and much appreciated. On behalf of the CKC Director, Mr. Carl Prinzel, I'd like to sincerely extend our appreciation to Dr. Lauren Johnson for sharing here today.